Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into some really, well, striking trends about how young people, Gen Z specifically, are getting involved in politics. And it's happening in some, frankly, surprising ways across places like Germany, South Korea, the Netherlands, UK, US.
Yeah, it's quite a pattern.
And we've gathered a whole stack of sources for this deep dive. We're really trying to focus on the science and the research behind these shifts.
And especially the rise of populism.
Exactly.
And I think our mission here for this deep dive is really to zero in on what might be driving this split we're seeing. Young men often leaning towards the populist right, while young women, well, they frequently favor the populist left.
Right.
And also, crucially, what the actual research tells us about populism itself. What is it?
Yeah, because when you look at the data, especially some of the rating pattern graphs and the sources, it just jumps out at you, this clear split. Like in Germany, you mentioned young men backing the far-right AfD much more, while young women are favoring parties on the populist left.
Mm-hmm. And the sources are clear. This isn't just Germany. We're seeing echoes of this elsewhere.
It's a really significant split politically within the same generation.
It really is. It demands a closer look, what forces are actually at play here.
So, yeah, what is going on, and where do we even start trying to understand it?
Well, the sources seem to agree we have to start with the basics. Like the really fundamental question social scientists ask, how do we even define populism?
Ah, right. Because if we're talking about young people voting populist?
Exactly. We need to know what that label actually means, at least in a research context, not just, casually.
Good point. Let's set that foundation. So, according to this research, what's the core definition?
At its heart, the definition revolves around focus. Populist parties or movements basically see politics as a fundamental struggle. It's between the people, who they see as this sort of pure unified group,
Okay.
and the elite establishment, which they paint as corrupt or self-serving or out of touch.
So it's that us versus them framing, us, the everyday folks, against them, the ones in power.
Precisely. That anti-elite stance is absolutely central.
Okay.
And the sources give examples, like the Manchie movement in the U.S. It's classified as populist, largely because, well, key figures within it explicitly define it that way, as anti-elitist.
Right.
And Bernie Sanders' movement, too, gets put under that populist umbrella for a similar reason. It's heavily centered on this fight against powerful elites, who he often calls, oligarchs.
But, I mean, anyone following politics knows that Sanders and Trump, despite maybe using some similar anti-elite language,
Oh, completely different.
they represent wildly different visions for society, right? So the research we're looking at classifies them differently. Far left populist, far right populist.
Exactly.
So how do researchers draw that line? What's the actual difference beyond just, railing against the elites?
That's where the underlying ideologies really come into play.
Right.
And the distinction is crucial because it tells you what these movements actually want to achieve if they get power.
Okay, so let's break down the far left populist side first. What defines that according to the research?
Generally, these parties, the ones classified as far left and often populist,
Yeah.
they fundamentally believe the current capitalist system isn't just flawed. It needs, radical change, rejection.
Okay, not just tinkering.
No, exactly. Their solutions involve major redistribution of wealth and resources, not just, modest tweaks.
Right.
The sources mention things like proposing really high taxes on the rich or price controls or even nationalizing industries.
Right.
And Bernie Sanders is the key populist example used here. He channels that anti-elite message specifically towards economic inequality, challenging corporate power.
Okay, so rejection of the current economic system, push for big redistribution. Got it. What about the far right side then?
Okay, so far-right parties, including the populist ones, are typically defined by two core beliefs, according to the research framework.
Two core beliefs. What's the first?
The first is nativism.
Nativist.
Yeah. It's the belief that the state, the country, belongs purely to the native group, however that's defined. And crucially, that immigrants or outsiders are a fundamental threat.
A threat to what? Culture? Economy?
It could be culture, economy, security. The point is they're seen as an inherent danger to the true nation.
Okay, nativism. That's one. What's the second core belief?
The second is a really strong emphasis on order and punishment.
Order and punishment.
Right. They believe society needs to be strictly ordered, and anyone who defies authority or breaks what they see as important social norms should be punished. strictly.
And how does the Magier example fit into this far-right definition?
Well, the sources point to Trump's rhetoric and proposed policies.
Mm.
The focus on seal the border, talk of a migrant invasion, calling for the largest deportation operation. That lines up pretty clearly with the nativist element.
Yeah.
And then on the punishment side, you look at actions or threats like deporting foreign students who protested against things he supported,
Right, I remember that.
or proposing to freeze funding for universities with diversity initiatives, DEI policies, that he didn't like. The sources make a point that previous right-wing U.S. presidents weren't nearly this strict on immigration enforcement, or this, well, explicit about punishing internal defiance.
Ah, so it's the degree and the focus that pushes it into the far-right populist category for these researchers, not just standard conservative.
That seems to be the argument presented, yes.
So, okay, it's not just being anti-elite. It's about where that energy goes. Is it channeled into a radical economic shakeup or into defending a perceived national identity through nativism and strict order?
Exactly. The fundamental vision for society ends up being incredibly different, even if they both start with that people versus elites language.
Okay, that distinction is clear. Now, beyond the anti-elite thing and the left-right ideological differences, do these populist movements, generally speaking, share any other common traits according to the research?
Yes, actually. The sources identify two more characteristics that tend to pop up pretty consistently in populist movements, whether they're left or right.
Okay, what are they?
First, they tend to take really complex issues, global economics, immigration policies, social change, you name it, and distill them down into overly simplistic narratives.
Ah, the simple answer approach.
Right. It's always the fault of the oligarchs, or it's all because of immigrants or globalists or, some easily identifiable scapegoat group. Complexity is kind of ignored or dismissed.
Right, boiling everything down to one bad guy or one simple cause.
Exactly. And the second thing is, unlike maybe more traditional political movements,
Yeah.
populist movements are very often built around a single, charismatic leader.
It's a strong leader figure.
Precisely. This leader is presented as someone almost uniquely capable of understanding and embodying the will of the people. And they're seen as having the strength and the will to actually fight the corrupt establishment on the people's behalf.
So, someone who cuts through all the noise, speaks directly for us, often with a really powerful personality.
Yeah, that combination, the simple answers, the strong, singular leader, it's a very powerful formula. It resonates.
Okay. Now, let's tackle something else the sources bring up. If populism is about fighting elites, simplifying issues, rallying behind a strong leader, maybe you think, well, maybe the elites are too powerful.
Right.
Or maybe politics is too complicated and needs simplifying. Maybe the country does need a strong hand right now. So why, then, is populism so often viewed negatively, even by, objective researchers?
Yeah, that's a really important question the sources address. The research shifts here from just defining it to looking at the consequences. What actually happens, on average, when populist movements gain power?
Okay, the historical track record.
Exactly. And the findings highlight two really significant potential problems based on historical studies.
And the first major problem identified, what is it?
It's a tendency to challenge and often erode democratic institutions. Things like checks and balances, independent courts, free press, the stuff that protects democracy.
Okay, how did they measure that?
Well, one big study mentioned looked at 46 populist governments across 33 countries from 1990 to 2018.
Right.
And they found that, on average, these populist leaders were 4 times more likely to trigger what researchers call democratic backsliding compared to non-populist leaders.
4 times more likely to actually weaken democracy. That's a stark finding.
It really is. And the study also found that once they got elected, populist leaders tended to stay in power longer.
Longer terms.
Yeah. And here's the really worrying part, according to the study. The longer they stayed in power, the less likely they were to ever leave office through a normal democratic election.
Wow.
And this pattern, they found, held true for both left-wing populists.
Right.
They mentioned examples like the Kirchners in Argentina, Chavez in Venezuela, and right-wing populists like Orban in Hungary or Berlusconi in Italy.
So the historical data suggests there's a real measurable risk that populist power, whether it's left or right, can end up undermining the democratic process itself.
On average, historically speaking, yes. That's the signal from this research.
Okay. And what was the second major problem identified in these historical studies?
They tend to be bad for the economy.
Bad for the economy. Okay, how did they figure that one out? That seems hard to isolate.
Yeah, it is tricky. One major study looked at a really long period, 1900 to 2020. They used this clever technique comparing economies under populist rule to what they called doppelganger economies.
Doppelganger economies, like economic twins.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
They created these synthetic control groups countries that had really similar economic starting points and structures, but didn't have populist governments during the same period.
Okay, so comparing them to a hypothetical what-if economy that didn't go populist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And compared to these doppelgangers, the study found that, on average, populist governments across the board reduced economic growth.
Reduced growth.
Yeah. And interestingly, in this particular study, left-wing populists, on average, actually saw slightly worse economic outcomes than the right-wing populists, though both tended to underperform.
Can you give us a few examples from the sources of, good or bad economic performance?
Sure. On the poor performance side, the sources point to pretty clear cases like Italy under Berlusconi, who was right-wing, or Venezuela under Maduro, who's left-wing.
Okay.
Then you have others like Turkey under Erdogan, right-wing, or Argentina under the Kirchners, left-wing.
Yeah.
They saw some periods of strong growth initially, but then, over the longer term, significantly underperformed compared to their doppelgangers, ended up in stagnation or decline.
Were there any exceptions mentioned? Any populist leaders or leaders associated with populism who didn't fit this negative pattern?
Yeah, the studies are careful to acknowledge exceptions. They're looking at averages, right?
Right.
So they cite Brazil's Getulio Vargas and Bolivia's Evo Morales, both more left-leaning populists, as cases where the economy actually performed better than the doppelganger comparison for significant periods.
Okay.
And the sources also note that some U.S. presidents who've been associated with populist streaks, like Teddy Roosevelt or FDR, are, widely seen as very successful presidents overall.
So it's not an iron law, but the historical average points towards a pretty significant risk to both democracy and the economy when populist leaders take the reins.
That's really the key takeaway from these historical studies, yeah. Electing a populist leader is presented as basically a risky bet based on the averages. There's a measurable historical chance they won't leave office democratically, and a measurable chance they'll make economic conditions worse, not better, in the long run.
Okay. So if it's historically a risky bet, why are people drawn to it? I mean, that's the big question. And specifically, why young people? They theoretically have the most to lose from long-term democratic decay or economic problems. The sources must dig into the drivers, right?
They do. The research points to two main underlying reasons people turn towards populism. The first one, and maybe the most fundamental, is economic insecurity.
Economic insecurity. Okay, how does that play out?
Well, studies pretty consistently show populism tends to flourish in what they call left-behind regions.
Left behind.
Yeah, areas experiencing economic decline or high inequality. Think parts of Eastern Germany after reunification, or old industrial heartlands in the UK or US. When large numbers of people feel like the economy just isn't working for them anymore, or that they've been forgotten.
Yeah.
That frustration, that desperation, can make populist promises of radical change seem really appealing.
That makes intuitive sense. If you feel like the current system has failed you, you're probably more open to someone promising to tear it down and start over.
Exactly. And this helps explain the historical rise of populism in Latin America before the 90s,
Right.
or the surge we saw in the U.S. and Europe after the 2008 financial crisis. Think of parties like Syriza in Greece during the Euro crisis, or the Five-Star Movement in Italy.
Right.
And arguably, it helps explain Bernie Sanders' popularity with young voters back in 2016, when youth unemployment in the U.S. was significantly higher than it was just a few years later in 2019.
But the sources also note that for today's Gen Z, especially in places like Europe maybe, where youth unemployment itself might not be the absolute biggest issue right now, the economic insecurity feels different.
It does seem to manifest differently, yeah. For this generation, the sources suggest economic insecurity is increasingly defined by just sky-high housing costs,
Housing.
making homeownership feel completely out of reach for many.
Mm.
And alongside that, a massively increased cost of living across the board, energy, food, just basic essentials.
Right.
These things are hitting young people particularly hard, even if they have a job. It fuels that same feeling of being left behind, of the system not working for them.
Okay, so economic pain, whether it's joblessness or cost of living and housing, that's a major driver, both historically and for young people today. What's the second key factor the research identifies?
Cultural factors.
Culture, okay.
Yeah. While economic insecurity seems to fuel both left and right populism, the sources suggest that far-right populism specifically often needs these cultural anxieties to really gain traction.
Right.
It frequently finds stronger support among demographics who maybe previously held a relatively high social status, but now perceive that status to be declining or under threat.
Like the examples you mentioned earlier, white working class men in the Rust Belt, maybe.
Exactly. The research often points to groups like white working class men in the U.S. Rust Belt or people in older industrial towns in the UK as examples. Groups who might feel this sense of declining status. It's often linked to economic shifts, of course, but it's felt really deeply on a cultural level, too.
And is that feeling of lost status where the nostalgia factor comes in, the longing for a perceived a better past?
Yes, absolutely. Populist leaders, especially on the right, are often very adept at tapping into that feeling. The sources mention how campaigns like Brexit, championed by figures like Nigel Farage, definitely evoked a sense of nostalgia for Britain's past influence or identity.
Mm.
And similarly, Trump's Make America Great Again slogan clearly resonated with a desire among some voters to return to a perceived golden age, maybe like the American 1950s.
Okay, so economic insecurity and cultural factors, particularly this sense of declining status or nostalgia. Now let's circle right back to where we started. That specific observation about Gen Z young men, specifically turning towards the far right, while young women lean towards the populist left. The sources must address this gender split directly.
They do, but they also acknowledge it's a relatively new trend, which makes it harder to explain definitively. The research is still emerging.
Right, it's happening now.
Exactly. But they offer three potential factors that might be contributing to this specific gender divergence within Gen Z populism.
Okay, what's the first potential factor?
One suggestion is a potential male backlash
Backlash against what?
against perceived extreme or overly assertive feminist ideas that might be prominent in certain parts of the media ecosystem popular with some young men. You know, stuff like online commentary, maybe video game culture discussions, or even critiques of traditional male roles in big franchises like Star Wars or action movies. A feeling that things have gone too far.
Okay, so a cultural reaction, specifically around gender dynamics, that's one possibility. What else?
Another potential factor highlighted is increasing loneliness among young men.
Loneliness. How does that connect?
Well, some recent research, which the sources note, has actually found a correlation between reported feelings of loneliness and a higher likelihood of voting for far-right parties. The causal link isn't perfectly clear, but the correlation is there.
Huh. That's, yeah, less intuitive, but interesting. Okay, loneliness. What's the third factor?
A third factor suggested is a pretty observable trend. Young men are increasingly falling behind young women in educational attainment, particularly getting university degrees.
Right, we hear about that gap quite a bit.
Yeah. And educated, well, it isn't just about job skills, right? It still brings considerable social status and economic opportunity in many societies. So this growing gap could be contributing to a sense of maybe relative decline or being left behind specifically among young men compared to their female peers.
So putting those three together, a possible cultural identity backlash around gender, maybe increased social isolation or loneliness, and a potential status gap linked to educational achievement.
Those are the factors suggested in the research we reviewed, yes.
And is there a sense that something is amplifying these factors, making them more potent now?
Yes, the sources definitely propose that these factors, which might have been simmering already, could have been significantly amplified, maybe even supercharged by social media.
Social media, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah, I mean, social media platforms, their algorithms often tend to reward and spread polarizing content much more effectively than nuanced discussion. It grabs attention.
Right. Outrage travels fast.
Exactly. And crucially, populist politicians and influencers are often extremely active and, frankly, very skilled at using these platforms. We've seen figures like Trump build huge followings on platforms often popular with young men, like YouTube or certain podcasts. And someone like Nigel Farage has a massive presence on TikTok in the UK, reaching younger demographics directly with his message, bypassing traditional media.
Okay. So bringing this all back together then, if we try to synthesize, the core reason for the overall rise in Gen Z turning towards populism, left or right, seems to line up with that main historical driver we discuss.
Increased economic insecurity.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That seems to be the most likely fundamental engine, according to the sources. That feeling of being shut out of economic opportunity, especially by the crushing cost of housing and just the general cost of living.
Hmm.
That's a major source of the populist sentiment among young people today.
Okay, and then the cultural factors we talked about,
Right.
including those more specific dynamics possibly affecting young men, the potential backlash, the loneliness, the education and status gap. Those likely help explain why we're seeing that stark split. Young men drifting right, young women leaning left, within that broader populist trend.
That seems to be the most plausible explanation based on the current research presented in the sources, yes. It's the economic insecurity providing the fuel and the cultural factors steering people towards either the left or right populist variants.
And it's worth remembering that point about risk. While the sources acknowledge, sure, historically, a populist leader might occasionally work out okay,
Those exceptions exist.
the weight of the historical data, the average outcome, strongly suggests that voting populist is, as the source put it, a risky bet.
Yeah, often leading to democratic erosion and worse economic performance down the line. That's the historical pattern.
So given all that, what do the sources suggest traditional or centrist politicians could actually do if they want to counter this trend, especially among young people? Is there a path forward suggested?
Well, the answer provided in the sources is framed as being simple yet complicated in practice.
Okay, simple how? Complicated how?
Simple to state.
Yeah.
Address the root cause. Address the economic insecurity head on,
Which means?
which means primarily build significantly more housing, enough to actually bring down those crushing property costs and rents, and fundamentally redesign markets for essential goods, energy, food to lower the everyday cost of living.
So build more houses, make things cheaper. Simple diagnosis.
Incredibly difficult political and practical execution.
Right. That's the complicated part.
Precisely. And the sources conclude that until those core economic pressures are effectively tackled and people feel things getting better,
Yeah.
parties offering those strongly held, even if, arguably oversimplified solutions like blaming immigrants for everything or promising a complete teardown of the system, they're likely to continue gaining traction.
And not just among young people, presumably?
Probably not. Potentially among older generations, too, who are also grappling with that same economic insecurity, maybe in different ways.
Okay. So, wow. We started by noticing this really striking, maybe counterintuitive trend in Gen Z voting, young men shifting right, young women left. And we've kind of gone through the research defining populism, looked at its historical track record, the risks to democracy, the risks to economies, and then explored the economic and cultural forces driving people towards it today, with some specific insights into the pressures facing young people, like housing and cost of living.
Yeah, and it seems clear that while these populist movements definitely resonate, they promise simple answers, strong leadership, especially to people feeling left behind or culturally anxious.
Right.
The historical evidence suggests, on average, they come with pretty substantial risks to the stability of democratic systems and often to economic prosperity in the long run.
But, and this seems like the crucial point, if that primary fuel is fundamental economic insecurity,
Right.
and our traditional political systems seem, well, slow or maybe unable to deliver effective, visible solutions to huge crises like housing affordability or the cost of living,
Yeah, if the mainstream isn't delivering.
then what does the continued appeal, maybe even the continued rise of populism really mean? Populism with its easy answers, yes, but also its historical baggage of risk. What does that mean for the future stability of the countries we've been talking about?
That really does raise a vital question, doesn't it? And it's something for you, listening, to consider as you look at the political landscape unfolding around you.